management there because
You're listening to Head South Radio with your host, Kat Meyer, a podcast dedicated to prioritizing pleasure and removing the stigma and shame around sex. We're here to be curious and have an open conversation about sexual health and relational wellness. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The information discussed is not a substitute for professional medical advice.
Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Kat Meyer, and on this episode of Head South Radio, we have Danielle Bezalel, also known as DB. She is the creator, executive producer, and host of the Sex Ed with DB podcast, a feminist podcast bringing you all the sex ed you never got, centering LGBTQ+ and BIPOC experts. In this episode, we discuss the role of pornography in shaping people's perceptions of pleasure and sexuality, and the ethical considerations when it comes to consuming pornography, especially concerning the portrayal of women's pleasure and consent. We also talk about how people can use pornography as a means to enhance their intimate relationships and communicate more openly about their desires. Please take a moment to like and review our show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I hope you enjoy this conversation about porn and pleasure. Thank you, Danielle, for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is fantastic.
I'm so glad you reached out. You had found us through your friend, our mutual friend now, Mariah of Sex Ed Files.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm so glad you reached out because you've been on my list of people to contact to have on the podcast. And so to get started, we're going to do some icebreakers to get to know each other and warm up. And then I'll jump into the conversation, which I'd love to speak to you about pleasure and porn.
Great.
So to get started, what fictional world or place would you like to visit?
That's really an interesting start. Somewhere with a beach, somewhere with really warm water and huge array of fruit trees that I could pick the fruit off right off the tree. Somewhere where the sun is shining and where all my friends and family are. And that's pumping really good music.
Okay. What's your favorite fruit?
I think it depends on the season. I guess technically an avocado, but that's kind of like a tricky answer. Maybe blueberries in addition to that, I would say.
What's your zodiac sign?
I'm a Sagittarius.
So your birthday's coming up.
It is, yeah, December 6th.
Oh, nice. Would you rather have the best sex of your life once or mediocre sex every day?
Ooh. Probably mediocre sex every day. I mean, we're going to get into this later, but the sex with myself would still be fantastic. So I'm not deterred.
It's very funny because I've asked this question a few times now with a few guests, and this question is always like, and then there's always like a stipulation, like someone's like, well, and actually masturbation has always been like, well, if I'm allowed to pleasure myself on the side, and that's still fantastic, like that. Mm-hmm. Or if I could recreate the best sex of my life with myself, then I would choose mediocre.
Which you can, spoiler alert.
Would you rather use a shower head or an electric toothbrush as a makeshift sex toy?
Oh, I would probably say an electric toothbrush. I feel like I'm more like of a vibrator person than like a air pulse or kind of like water person. Something I've learned throughout the many years of my masturbation journey as a person who has sex with myself. But yeah, I would probably say the backside of an electrical toothbrush.
All right, cool. Would you rather have sex to the same song every day or never have sex with music on?
The same song I feel like would end up feeling like some sort of torture. So I think never music, and maybe we could like sing along to something ourselves without needing an additional backtrack.
It would start feeling like Groundhog Day or like
right. Yeah, exactly.
Mind distorting. Would you rather have sex in the morning or late at night?
Honestly, neither. Like I'm like a midday evening gal, but if I had to choose, I would say late at night. I feel like in the morning, it's kind of hard for me to really get in the mood. And part of that is like, I'm assigned female at birth. Like I have female hormones. Those are different than male hormones in terms of when like cis men and cis women like really come alive in their sexualness during the day. And so I just like genuinely don't feel that typically in the morning. I'm more of like a slow wake up. I'll kind of check my phone. I'll like hang out in bed for a bit, but it's very rare, if at all, for me to feel in the mood in the morning.
Yeah. Siesta. Okay. So Danielle, tell us who you are, what you do, the work you do, and the people you work with.
Really great. First of all, like your icebreakers are fantastic. So really happy to be answering those. Okay, so who I am. I'm Danielle Bezalel. I use she, her pronouns. I also go by DB, a nickname that was given to me in middle school and has stuck with my OG pals ever since. I am the creator and host of the Sex Ed with DB podcast. We are a feminist podcast bringing you all the sex ed you never got through unique and entertaining storytelling, centering LGBTQ and BIPOC experts. And who we work with. I have 3 amazing folks on my team right now. I'm very, very lucky to do the podcast and our social media with. And I also have really wonderful partners and sponsors who I've been working with for years and years that create products and items that I personally use myself and really am excited to tell people about. And my podcast and social media are for everybody, but I would say that mostly folks who identify as women and queer people and people ages 18 to 35 most tune in to my show.
Yeah, I have to say your TikTok is excellent and the content that you're creating is really great on there.
I appreciate it.
For entertainment purposes as well as informative purposes.
Yeah, I really like using humor and like being stupid and silly to really disarm the viewer because I think these topics hold a lot of weight for people and can be very emotionally charged. And so I think the more that we can laugh about it and just be a little goofy, the more likely we are to relate to one another and be able to actually understand and entertain these ideas, these sometimes challenging ideas that I bring to the table with sex ed.
Yeah, I would say your TikTok is seamless within TikTok for that. Like it really does work within that platform.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important to destigmatize things by making them digestible. And so providing people with what they are looking for on that platform in that way is great. It's like the fun size Snickers is what you're creating. And it's what people are looking for on that platform. Whereas I feel like some people sometimes try to use that and create topics, but it's not the same. It's not translating well.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like the way that TikTok functions with like short, bite-sized kind of trending sounds and like silly music and those kinds of things, I'm really able to use those to my advantage and relate them to some sort of sex ed topic where otherwise it could be just a very dry conversation that no one really wants to have. But when you're making content for young people, our TikTok audience is definitely like teenagers all the way through, people in their 70s, we run the gamut. But I think specifically for teens and young people, like they need to be hooked in that first couple seconds. So TikTok allows me to do that.
I think it's really excellent, the work that you're putting out, especially on that platform and the way that it's delivered.
Thank you.
So I wanted to jump into the topic that we kind of discussed in our pre-interview, and you brought up porn. And so my first question is, can you explain the role of pornography in shaping people's perceptions of pleasure and sexuality?
Absolutely. It has a huge role. Porn has a huge, huge role, especially, if we're focusing in on our American society here. I think like when we zoom out in the world, porn could look different in different areas of the world. But specifically when we're talking about American porn that's mainstream, that is the first piece of media usually that young people end up seeing because they have access to the internet. And so one of the most recent stats, to my understanding, is that cis boys in this country see porn as early as 11 years old. That's like the average age. And cis girls first see porn at the average age of 14. And so when we're thinking about the messages that we're receiving as kids, when we're seeing porn, especially mainstream porn, they can be pretty frightening in terms of who is getting pleasure, who is accessing that pleasure, who is deserving of that. What are the power dynamics? What does the sexism and misogyny look like? What kinds of bodies are we seeing? What kinds of people are we seeing? Who are we seeing? Are we seeing white people? Are we seeing Black people? What kinds of fetishization is happening in porn, right? There are endless questions that we can ask. And so I think when we're thinking about that first view of it, that's one particular experience. But then as we move on in our sexuality and like as that develops for most people after they go through puberty and then, in their late teens and early 20s, those early images and those early pieces of media really impact subconsciously even the way that we view what we enjoy in our sex with ourselves and with our future partners. And so it's really something that we need to be aware of so that we're able to have the conversation about it with young people.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also like to recognize that is, you're watching a performance, you're watching actors perform.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, it's like professionals. It develops how we, quote unquote, perform in the bedroom and thinking that this is how I should be. So not even like your experience of receiving, but your experience of like, I'm going to use the word performing with your partner when that's actually maybe that doesn't feel good, but you're moaning in this way or moving in that way because you've seen it and you think that that's the norm, or that's become the normalized version of what sex should look like because that's what we're seeing. What are some common misconceptions and stereotypes about pleasure that are perpetuated by pornography, and how can these be addressed?
Yeah. I mean, I think, when we're talking about mainstream porn, and later we'll get into ethical porn and what that really looks like. But I think in terms of the messaging, when we're talking about like straight cis porn, like PV sex in particular, we get the messages that big penises are normal, right? Like penises in porn on average, I believe, are somewhere around 8 inches, where penises in real life are closer to like 3 to 6 inches, and closer to the like 5 inches on average. And so when we're looking at breasts, the same thing. Like we typically see really large breasts, really small nipples in porn, and the reality of what people's breasts and nipples can look like, they run the gamut of big to small to non-existent. People get double mastectomies. Some people don't even have breasts. Like there are all sorts of ways that breasts and chests can look. And especially with nipples too, like the nipples that we see in porn, they're just like usually pretty tiny and pretty pink and like, just like really this quote unquote idealized version of nipples. Whereas nipples in real life look very different. They can be much larger. The areola can be much larger. There can be bumps on them. They can be dark. They can be light, etc. So I think when we're looking at, and same thing with body hair, right? Like we never see body hair in porn. Typically, everyone's like pretty clean shaven and like waxed. When we're looking at vulvas, they look, really hairless and like a very young person's vulva. When in reality, like people have pubes and most people don't shave their pubes like that, or they groom them or whatever. And so I think like just even if you didn't hear anything and if you didn't even press play, you can tell what's going on. As like an old film student, we would call that mise en scène, like everything that happens on the screen before you like roll the cameras. So essentially just like a still image, like what does that look like? And so when you're thinking about that, when you just see the bodies, that's like the first thing that we learn about what's normalized or what should be normal, quote unquote, in real life sex when we're looking at porn. And then when we press play and we see that kinds of acts that are happening, right? More often than not, it is the gaze of looking towards the pinnacle or the peak of sex when the man comes. And so we're not really typically focused on the woman's pleasure. We're not really focused on what that's like for her to reach orgasm. Now, I think that is changing a little bit. I do think there are more mainstream porn that you can find where the man is going down on the woman or they're using a vibrator on her. But I do think that for a very long time, it was not focused on women's pleasure. And so those are just the few things that I think we're kind of taught just by the way in which these things are prioritized. One other thing I'll mention before we move on from this, though, is like the kinds of scenes that we're seeing and like the most popular titles, right? So, like, when you actually, like, in 2022, the most popular Pornhub category was lesbian. So, when you're really breaking that down, I find that to be really interesting because not only lesbians watch lesbian porn, every kind of person with every kind of sexuality watches lesbian porn. Why is that, right? Like, what's happening in lesbian porn? Well, women are focusing on other women. It's
Mhm.
softer in some cases. It is more romantic in some cases, not everything, right? There's definitely lesbian porn that you can find that's like rougher and kinkier. But I do think that that speaks volumes to what people actually want to see and like what they're actually interested in versus what gets made.
Oh, definitely. I think it's with lesbian porn, there is a focus on pleasure and the duality, like both
Mhm.
parties experiencing pleasure versus like one sided, to your point of like how historically it has been presented.
Mhm.
I thought about this when I started exploring doing a podcast. I was talking to a cousin of mine who has a podcast about drug addiction, but he brought up the idea that when he was a kid, porn was literally like squibbly, like late night bunny ears trying to figure out and like seeing a boob and being like, oh my God. And, maybe a friend getting their dad's VHS tape.
Totally.
And so that was, I'm going to age us, and that was probably 30 years ago
Right.
when he first saw porn, maybe at 11 years old, but in the 90s.
Mhm.
And to think about now and the access of it. So you were saying like the average age for a cis male is probably 11. And
Mhm.
so them getting access to it, but then also this making it accessible to everybody has now brought into the fold women pursuing and looking for porn for themselves.
Right.
And so that brings me to my next question. How can women use pornography as a tool for self-discovery and exploring their own desires and preferences?
This is a great question because there are a lot of porn options out there specifically marketed towards women and queer people. And I'll talk briefly now about ethical porn because I think they're one and the same. And
That's my
so
next question, by the way,
okay,
too.
okay,
So,
perfect. So then maybe I'll just talk through like what the different porn for women could really look like. So a few of the porn companies that I want to mention that are geared more towards women. And then I'll speak to the piece around self discovery and why I find these companies to be really awesome. The first one is Dipsy. It's an audio erotica company that shares like stories essentially by voice actors that are sexy, short audio stories that are very fantasy based. So they have, a farmer that's kind of like taking you to his ranch, and they have like a professor having sex with their student, like off limits. They have like all of these ways to explore. And so I really personally like Dipsy because I think the content and the quality of the content is very high and it's written by women and queer people. And so
mhm.
when you have women and queer people behind the camera, so to speak, or behind the scenes, I feel like the stories that are represented are more for us. And so when, Dipsy first started, they also had all this data around and research around how like cis women in particular are more auditory, whereas cis men are more visual. And so obviously there are exceptions. This is not a rule. Like you can like whatever you like, but I do think there is something there around like why are women so into storytelling and really into describing a scene and negotiate, there's like all of these pieces to it. And I
Mhm.
think that it's just a really smart idea to be able to pick and choose what kinds of stories and what kinds of voices and who is involved in the narrative. Is it kinky? Is it not? Like, I think that that's what makes an app like Dipsy so special. And so that's kind of like the first piece that I want to share. And then there's also companies like Make Love Not Porn, where, they're quote unquote make love not porn stars, which are just regular people like having sex. And I think this is super exciting for women to explore as well, because there really aren't that many companies that are doing that allow us as women to be like, hey, your body looks like mine. Like that to me is a turn on, that I'm able to imagine myself in this scene. And so, yeah, I think like there's so much for women and queer people to be able to explore in porn, even if Pornhub porn or mainstream porn isn't the place. There are definitely other places for it.
I love that you brought up Dipsea. Dipsy.
Dipsea, yeah,
Yeah.
Dipsea.
Because to me, and I've thought of that of like the audible visual learning, but I also have recognized like for cis men that I know who have stopped watching porn, and like their reasoning behind it was like, it was just actually making them feel bad visually, like recognizing that like what they were seeing was affecting how they felt during their own intimate experiences, because it was a performance, and then feeling like you have to meet. It's like watching Daniel Day-Lewis, and then you have to like live your life as if you're Daniel Day-Lewis.
Right.
That's kind of hard. So recognizing that once they stopped and the improvement they had on their own intimacy, but then I thought of like, well, if you were listening and you were using your imagination and engaging with porn in a different way, because that's what I feel like with the audible, you're using your mind and seeing things. It's like reading a book, listening to an audiobook, and fantasizing versus watching something and then doing the job and being done with it, but actually engaging with porn in a different way. What are your thoughts on that? How do we engage, and what's our relationship? And then we can jump into ethical, but that was something that came up like as you were speaking.
Yeah.
How can people change their relationship to porn if they feel like they have an issue or that it is affecting them because the visual?
Yeah.
Are there options for people for audible that isn't just directed towards female or queer?
Great question. Yeah, no, I think like it's really interesting just to speak on this like anecdotal, at least male perspective around like, well, I can't watch porn anymore because like I think it's harmful. And like I actually think that like porn needs to be banned because it's so addictive. This is a narrative that comes up a lot. And I think that it's really important to recognize as an individual your own limits and your own comfort. But I think it's really equally critical to consider the fact that not everyone has the same relationship to porn that you might. And so you should really speak for yourself when it comes to the way in which you engage with porn. Anecdotally, I've heard a lot of cis men say similar things of like, I just had to cut porn out completely because it was like ruining my life. And it's like, yeah, that really sucks. And I believe that that was your reality. And at the same time, like people are going to find a way to find it anyway. You can't just ban porn. Like now that it's out there, that's just unrealistic. So I just wanted to save a little space to kind of consider if you're out there and listening and you know somebody who has a similar kind of idea, like know that their experience is not necessarily everyone's experience. A lot of people are fully able to engage in porn in a healthy way. And for many people, it adds a lot to their sex lives. And we should not be shaming or stigmatizing porn. And that's the answer to that for me. But in terms of other kinds of porn that's visual, that is geared towards men, I mean, I'm sure that it's out there. I just don't, off the top of my head, like know of any specific companies that are geared towards men other than Erica Lust. I feel like that is an ethical porn site that does have male focused content, but that is an ethical porn site. So if you're out there and you're a man wanting to focus on porn that might feel a little better to watch, check out Erica Lust.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So then, speaking of ethical porn,
Yeah.
what differentiates ethical porn from non-ethical porn? What are people looking for when they're out there searching the internet when it comes to ethical porn?
So ethical porn, essentially, like the name suggests, is ethically produced content. And the reason why it's labeled ethically is because the production is held to a certain set of standards or ethics that are determined by the people who run the company, the producers of the content, and the performers. So when we're really breaking that down, we think about the fact that ethical porn pays its performers fairly. Ethical porn has conversations between the producers, the owners, and the performers about the kinds of scenes that they're going to do, about the way in which that they engage in front of the camera and before the shot and after the shot. Ethical porn uses different kinds of bodies and different kinds of stories and is diverse and ensures that people have a say in the way in which that their stories get told. It's created in an environment that's ethical and transparent. There are so many different things that ethical porn can fall under, but the best way to know if a porn site is ethical is by chatting with performers and asking them, how does it feel to work for this company? Or what was your experience doing work for this organization? What did it feel like to do a scene with this person here? And so, sex workers are the experts in their own experience and in their profession. They are professionals who do this work in this field and know a lot more than, an educator kind of being the middleman. So definitely would encourage you out there to check out some sex workers. We've had a couple on Sex Ed with DB. So if you check out our podcast, you can scroll through and learn a little bit more. One great conversation we had was with an adult film star and sex worker named Mia Little, if you want to check out her name. And so when we're thinking about ethical porn sites, right? I already named Dipsy. I named Make Love Not Porn. I already named Erica Lust. There's also Crash Pad series that is specifically focused in LGBTQ plus and kinky ethical porn. And so there are a lot of these kinds of sites out there. It's really interesting because I did a TikTok on ethical porn almost a year ago now, and it blew up. It has like 650,000 views or something like that. And we get so many comments on it that come from people with these kinds of responses of like, well, if I have to pay for it, then I'm not going to pay for it. And if you're one of those people out there who are thinking like, well, I can just get my porn for free, why would I pay for it? First of all, like, do you pay, or does someone in your family or friends pay for Netflix and Hulu and Apple TV and all of these other streaming services you use? Like, yes, people have to pay for their entertainment. If you think about people who are performing in ethical porn, it is entertainment. I mean, it is no different. We should be supporting people to get paid a fair wage and to make sure that we are not adding to the problem of, exploiting people for their work and for their expertise and for their value.
Mm-hmm.
Other kinds of comments that we get are along the lines of, well, my porn is definitely not ethical and I don't care. Like, people aren't afraid to say, I really don't give a shit that this isn't ethical. And that's kind of the end of it. And if you're somebody who is like that or knows someone like that, I really encourage you to consider why you don't care about other people's livelihood and why you don't care about the way in which folks' human rights are being denied if we're not consuming porn ethically. So yeah, it's just a really interesting thing. I think like it's a newer topic, but I'm hoping that with more conversation, with more education, it's changing.
Absolutely. I'm going to liken it to farming and what we consume. And if you think about like going to a major mass produced grocery store and like trying to shop for things, but then also going to a farmer's market and meeting the farmers who are picking those vegetables and being able to have a conversation about the eggplant or the spinach, and then knowing fully like, yeah, these are organic. We didn't use a till. Like, all of that information is the same as like engaging with a sex worker and asking them the questions. And I think that there are people who are like, I don't care, I'm going to eat blah, blah, blah. Fair enough. But I love that you're posing the question of like, well, think about why you feel that way. Like, let's just kind of, if I just implore you to, explore that within yourself. Like, why do you not care? Like, you don't have to care as much as everybody else all the time, but like, just think about why and why do you feel the need to like argue it or be like, this is my stance. But what is that stance? What are you standing for?
Mm-hmm. Totally. And I also want to name OnlyFans, right? Because I do think platforms like OnlyFans have really changed the game for the way in which that creators and sex workers are able to run their own businesses because they're in charge, right? Like theoretically, folks who create OnlyFans pages are making their own content, they're making their own prices, and they are able to decide the way in which they want to engage with their audience. Whereas sex workers who work in like kind of these larger male driven porn companies like don't necessarily get all of the same liberties. And so if you're someone who would consider subscribing to someone on OnlyFans, or think about it this way, in a not sex worker way, I'm someone who really loves watching ASMR videos and like, you know, I've tipped my like favorite ASM artist because they're providing an entertainment service for me.
Mhm.
So like, why would we not think of sex workers in the same way?
It's a very important question. I also think the safety and human rights component that people don't actually think about. And I remember I was interviewing a sex worker, Savannah, and she used the reference of like, sex workers are oftentimes the canaries in the mine and are alerting us to the bigger issues. Like, you might not think it matters now, but I assure you that like 3-5 years down the road, you're going to see where these things and where these liberties and rights and support for these groups of people, marginalized people, including sex workers, are then bleeding out into the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're scared and then you're worried and then now you care. But if you're not thinking about it now, down the road, it's going to implode. It's going to become a problem. I want to point out too that the ACLU is doing amazing things with sex workers' rights, including like, I believe it was MasterCard had shut down, like they weren't allowing certain sex workers to collect money and kind of prohibiting things. And this is a bigger conversation and probably a whole nother, it's definitely multiple episodes of sex workers' rights and then sex trafficking and the differentiation between those two. And I did speak to Savannah in the previous episode about that. And so it's kind of within that realm of like validating and protecting sex workers. Like if you're enjoying it, to your point, like ASMR, going to a museum and seeing an artist's work, going to a concert, you know, you're paying for that ticket.
Right.
And so why is this devalued in comparison with your with the rest of your pleasure?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's an important thing to like really look in the mirror about, right? And really consider like, well, the only difference here is that you feel shame about enjoying this. And so you feel like you equate that shame to not wanting to even engage in what that means for how you're utilizing this entertainment. And so I think people just want to put it away and shove it under the bed. But I think the more and more honest we are about porn's place in our lives and in a lot of people's sex lives, and the fact that, again, for a lot of people, it is this healthy relationship that they have with it, we should start talking about paying people and making sure that we're consuming it ethically.
Absolutely. Let's take a quick break. Hey there. Allow me to introduce you to something that has completely transformed my body, the floss. The floss isn't just a trend, it's a movement method that has reshaped the way I approach my well-being. Imagine a subscription-based platform that offers you a key to unlocking your body's potential. Fascia flossing, as it's called, doesn't just scratch the surface, it remaps the fascia network of your body. Through a tailored blend of physical manipulation, guided resistance movement, and muscle elongation techniques, it's like giving your body a personalized renovation. Since adding the floss to my daily practice in 2019, I've experienced incredible improvements across the board. My mind-body connection is stronger than ever. And let's talk about the intimate aspects. Yes, it has boosted my sexual health connection too. You can hear more about that in the episode I recorded with the founder of the floss, Bonnie Krotzer. The floss supports all of my body systems, enhances mobility, offers prevention, and provides that active recovery we all need. Curious to learn more? Head over to thefloss.com, and if you use the code HEADSOUTH, HEADSOUTH, all caps, no spaces, you'll receive 50% off the first month. Let's get back to the podcast. So shifting gears a little bit, how can couples use pornography as a means to enhance their intimate relationships and communicate more openly about their desires?
Yeah, if you're in a partnership and you haven't watched porn together and you're both kind of like, oh, like I'm interested in this. Are you interested in this? Like maybe you talk about it first and see what the feels are for each person. And if each person's like pretty open to it, then maybe check out, one of those ethical porn sites that I shared, or do your own research and find other kinds of ethical porn. If you just type in ethical porn companies and do some, 5 minutes of Google searching and read some articles, I'm sure that you can find something that feels good for both of you, and pick a video together and just like start watching it. Like get ready. Like maybe there's some foreplay. Maybe you've been making out and then maybe you have the video loaded, and just see what comes of it. Like, do you want to just watch it together? Do you want to be touching each other while you're watching it? Do you want to involve any toys or lube or any of those things? Are you only wanting to use it as like getting excited and then maybe you want to turn it off and then focus on each other? There are lots of different ways that you can use it. And your first time doing this might not and probably won't be your last time. So just know that there's a lot of room to figure out what you like and what you don't like, and how to share that with your partner afterwards. And whatever kind of aftercare that you have is super important, of like, hey, how did that feel? Did you like that? Did you like the video that we picked? Or like, no, I didn't really like that. Next time I would want to try this. And just know that, as long as your communication is open, and as long as you are on the same page about what you want to do and when you want to do it, then it can add a lot to your fantasy and your role playing and your intimacy and the way in which that you connect with one another.
I think about it like as if you were doing a dance class with your partner. Obviously, you're going to talk about it before. You're going to talk as you're trying to do it and learning the steps and like working together. And then after, on the car ride home, you're talking about it. So like I think it's anytime you're engaging with your partner. And you mentioned aftercare, and I'd love for you to break down like the conversation before, during, and after. And that goes for sex, that goes for watching porn, engaging with a partner in any way. And what is before, during, and after care?
Yeah. So beforehand, and of course, like this conversation and these conversations have a lot of nuance. Like if you are on a first date versus you being together for 30 plus years, like, and everywhere in between and beyond, this can look very different. But if you are someone, say, who's in kind of like a newer relationship, like within the first year of you getting together, you might have more of these conversations than I, for example, have been with my partner for 7 years. Like sometimes we have these conversations, sometimes we don't. It really depends on like our moods and if we need them. But I do think that when we're thinking about like the before conversation, typically it's like, what are you in the mood for? How are you feeling? Is it okay if I touch you here? Can I touch you here? Like there's a lot of kind of like curiosity that both of you should have with each other. And then during, it's kind of like, okay, how does this make you feel? Can I do anything differently? Are you ready for the condom? Like, can I use this lube? And then if you're the giver of the comments, like, oh, I want you to touch me here. Can you tell me this? Like, I want you to talk me through this scene, right? So it's kind of like being really clear and open about like what you want, how you feel about it, and leaving room for there to be some like negotiation within that. Of course, if this is like closer to first, third, fifth date, and you're more so talking about like protection and STIs, like that kind of conversation should be happening in the before section, not really during, so that there aren't really any surprises. And then for aftercare, like say you both are satisfied, you're feeling pleasure, not necessary for both of you or either of you to reach orgasm if that's not the desire. Maybe you just want to have some pleasure, but say you do reach orgasm or one of you does, whatever the case may be. If that conversation is happening afterwards, maybe that looks like, how did that go? Like, how did you feel? I noticed during this moment you were looking at me like this. Like, did you want to say X, Y, and Z? Or, like really being able to maybe talk about like how that went. But for some people, maybe that's just like, I want to cuddle and I don't really want to talk, or I want to massage, or I just want to hug, or let's take a shower together. So it really depends on the couple, if we're talking about a monogamous partnership specifically too, and what each person really wants and needs out of it. And it can shift and change over time, depending on the kinds of acts that you do, say something didn't go as smoothly, maybe there's some hurt feelings or something that needs to be kind of discussed. Like all of those things can happen before, during, or after whatever kind of act that you're going for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that leads me to, if a couple is introducing porn and they're watching it and maybe like someone's like, oh, I want to show you this video. And then the other person is experiencing it and being like, whoa,
Right.
shocked,
Not into
right?
it. Yeah.
Not into this. How do you recommend they navigate that?
Yeah. This is a really important part of sex, just as important as, any other conversation around rejection is. There are plenty of podcasts and lesson plans all around the importance of yes means yes, but we rarely talk about what happens if like someone is like still feeling like a little awkward, or like what if their body language is really different. Like I don't feel like we talk about the nuances around this as much, and especially if you're introducing porn, and if it's like a kind of porn that's maybe like a certain kind of kink or a fetish that you're really into that might be different, right? Like quote unquote outside of the norm. And so that conversation you might want to have that before you show that person, just to really like set the scene, no pun intended, but to say like, hey, I'm really excited to show you this thing that really excites me, but I'm a little nervous. And here's why I'm nervous. Like I'm really into like feet, or I'm really into men in skirts, or I'm, whatever the thing that you're into is, like there's a video on it, I guarantee. And if there isn't, then like feel empowered to make it. You can always make your own porn. But I think like naming whatever feeling that you might be feeling could be really empowering and just like take a lot of the pressure off. And again, it's very possible that then your partner's like, I don't really want to watch that. Or like, that doesn't really excite me, but like, you should do that. Or like, if they respond in a way that's like cruel or like rude, then that should be like not necessarily a red flag, because maybe they're just like really surprised and need processing time. But I do think that it's important for you to like recognize that like their issues aren't your issues. And like that's maybe their discomfort with whatever you're sharing with them. So know that this conversation can go a multitude of ways, but it might be a good idea for you to just talk about it, like not in a sexual situation, so it's not as vulnerable. And then maybe in the future, you can kind of reference it again and be like, hey, remember this thing that I talked about? Are you open to at least like trying it? And if they say yes, then that's great. You try it, see how it goes. If they still are like, I thought about it and I still don't really want to do that, then know that like that's also okay for you to be experiencing that excitement and that kind of media on your own, because as we will talk about, like sex with yourself is just as important, if not more, honestly, I might even make that claim, than sex with a partner. Because like in order for you to even engage with a partner, you first need to know what feels good in your body and what your love looks like for yourself and what your pleasure looks like. So I think like know that if your partner isn't open to it, it doesn't mean the relationship is over. It just means you need to navigate what that looks like for you and what that negotiation with yourself or with your partner might feel like.
So yeah, to expand on that, I would love to hear more about solo play, masturbation, self sex. I've learned over the course of this year working with Head South, all of these new terminologies for what is essentially masturbation. And I love it because I feel like it does help destigmatize the shame around masturbation and opens up the conversation for people to explore and enjoy themselves in a different way. So what is your advice for people kind of new to this, using toys, not using toys, using lubes, kind of the tools and tricks of things that you have introduced to your audience, to your students around solo play?
Yeah, I think that masturbation and solo play are just incredibly empowering to feel connected to our bodies and just feel a genuine sense of pleasure, happiness, and joy. We also know from research that there are positive health benefits of masturbation. So when we're thinking about, okay, masturbation could help you fall asleep and stay asleep, like your quality of sleep could improve. It could relieve period cramps. It could also make you feel less stressed, and more endorphins equal more happiness. So, and at the end of the day, like, I don't need to give you a laundry list. Like, if you've ever masturbated and if you've ever orgasmed, you're like, I don't really need to know more than that. Like, it just feels good. And that's reason enough. And so if you're someone who's like a little new to masturbation, maybe you can access a point when you were younger when you learned like what felt good in your body, and you could just like go back to the roots of that. If there was like a certain position or a certain like household item that you would use when you were a kid, like if you're struggling to try to find something new or like release some of the guilt and shame around it, like go back to the roots and like don't be embarrassed. Like if you are someone who needs to be in a certain way or thinking of a certain thing in order to access that, because like, again, these messages and the experiences we have as kids and as young people when we're coming into our sexual selves, they have a lifelong impact sometimes on the way in which we are as adults. And so like important for you to be able to access that if you're kind of having trouble. If you're someone who's like, I'm good, like I got the, the mental part down. I just need to know like what kinds of physical items would maybe help me. I might offer a few different pieces of advice. One is like really try to figure out, based on the body parts that you have, what feels best in terms of the way in which you engage with those body parts. So if you're someone who really likes nipple play, or you really like clitoral play or internal or anal play, it really depends on the way in which you like to engage in your own body. And then the other thing I'll say is like, always try a toy. I think like toys are there to enhance our experience. They're there to add the cherry on top to what is already a really awesome sundae. And so if you can try a toy that will help you reach orgasm faster and stronger, why not? If that's the preferable way that you want to orgasm, that's great. If you just want to use it once in a while or every other time, like totally up to you. It could also really help in partnership. Research shows that 75 to 85% of people with clitorises prefer clitoral stimulation or need it in order to reach orgasm. And when we're thinking about like typical partnered PV sex, if we're talking about like a straight cis hetero relationship, that's not really happening with a penis, right? Like there needs to be some sort of other hands, mouth, toy involvement to be able to reach orgasm or to gain pleasure. So could really be beneficial in partnered sex. Lube, 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 lube. I'll say it a million times. Lube is so fantastic. It can really add to pleasure and play, decrease friction and increase pleasure. You just need to be careful about the kind of lube that you use depending on the kind of toy. So silicone-based toys should not be used with silicone-based lube because it can cause the toy to break down, cause bacteria to get in the toy, which could lead to infection. So when you're using a silicone-based toy, which is what many toys are made out of, you're really going to want to use water-based lube or oil-based lube with that toy. Also, if you're using condoms, consider, okay, oil-based lube should not be used with condoms. It can break down the condom and cause it to tear. So you can use silicone or water-based lube with condoms. So there are like all these little pieces to learn when you're in your journey. And if you want to check out, we have really amazing discounts with really awesome partners in the sex toy and the lube space. If you go to sexedwithdb.com/discounts, you can learn more. And the final thing that I'll say on toys and lube is like, really make sure that the brand that you're choosing is reputable and makes body safe materials. Sex toys are considered a novelty item in the US, and therefore they do not have to be regulated. And so that's really problematic when we're not really sure where to buy the toy or what kind of material the toy is made out of. And we want to be extra careful that it's made with medical grade silicone, or, like if it's made of glass, it's made of a certain kind of glass that like, if you want to use temperature play, that it can withstand that. And so, yeah, it's just really important that you pick a brand that you can trust to make body safe materials for you.
Yeah, because I think it's also like things can be coated. So they can claim it's one thing, but it's actually coated and there's other materials involved in the assembly of that product. I just wanted to go back to what you were saying. And in terms of preferences and also media, so kind of tying this whole conversation in, and my own personal experience of like, I thought I masturbated weird my whole life because what I had seen in media, especially as like a teenager into young adulthood, seeing women masturbate in movies wasn't how I would masturbate. That's not even the position.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize until later on, actually, Natalie Portman in Black Swan was like the first time I had seen a woman roll onto her belly and
Oh,
like
yeah.
use pressure.
Totally.
Then I was like, oh, and I've recently seen articles where women have written about this, of like seeing that scene was validating in how they experienced masturbation, because oftentimes you see a woman like reach for a dildo and then like
And then just go.
sitting up or laying there and she's like, yeah, and then it's
Right.
done.
Right.
And I was like, that is not how I experience it. And I was
Mhm.
like, is this weird? And so that was one of the few pieces of media that I had seen where it was validating. And then to see like articles written about that of women expressing like, whoa, that's the first time I've seen. And like in other films and media have shown that and depicted masturbation from real experiences, which are all very different in a variety. Like to your point of like half the people I ask about the shower head or the toothbrush,
Mhm.
like everyone's picking one or the other.
Right.
And those are two very different experiences and two very different preferences that both bring pleasure to the person. And so I love the idea of like exploring it. You might not see what feels good for you in media, or you might not have experienced it in partnered. So encouraging people to kind of explore and move their bodies in different ways to kind of find what works, and then use that information, that data, to
Right.
share it with partners. I think that's one of the beauties of engaging with porn, engaging with your body in self-exploration, in solo play, and using that to share.
Totally. Yeah. No, I'm glad that you said that. Now that you're saying it, I do kind of remember that scene. And I also just want to note that like confidence and like body love is a really big part of this conversation, because once we in our own body and mind can feel, yeah, like I deserve pleasure. I feel good about my body. I feel good about making time out of my day and not feeling guilty to give myself something that feels really good. Like once we can get on the same page about that, then a lot of those other pieces about communicating that with our partner and being able to use the right toy for us, like all of those things will follow once we can really, really be honest with ourselves and say like, and use the mantra of like, I love my body. I love myself. I'm deserving of pleasure. There's nothing wrong about this. There's nothing shameful. Then I think we are then able to make that next step.
And pleasure is personal and it's a journey. So it's not going to be listening to this podcast and then you discover everything about yourself.
Right.
Both of us who have both been on this journey, and you've, studied and researched and done so much data in collecting around subjects like masturbation and how to then educate people from those source points. Like you're still on your own journey
Mm-hmm.
in this practice, in this process.
Totally. Yeah. And it's a lifelong thing. I mean, I think like different stages that you go through, like different experiences that you have where you might have painful sex, or you might experience depression or anxiety, or, there are different like mental health states that you're in that really affect your libido and the way in which you experience the world. And like, of course, like everyone has different ways in which that they like to engage or not engage in pleasure, depending on what's going on. And when you throw a partner into there, right, there are two people that you're kind of like, okay, how do we navigate this together?
Mm-hmm.
But that's why I do think that solo play is so powerful, because you are in charge of your own destiny and journey and your own pleasure.
I just have one more thing on that solo play, is that I think for some people in certain relationships feel like that's not okay. Like their partner masturbating or doing that is, I have in my youth been told by other girlfriends, like he was cheating on me. Like
Right.
that feels like that. Right. So I am sure you've heard that before, or that
I
kind
have,
of
yeah.
expression. And I'm not here to like tell people how they should experience their relationships in that way.
Right.
But I think, what is your take on that, of like partners who believe that that's an infidelity, or that's a form of cheating?
Right. I've heard this exact idea too with people who watch porn, right? Is like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, like you're being unfaithful.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, everyone has their own boundaries about the way in which that they engage in a relationship. However, I do think it's really important to recognize what might be going on for you behind that fear. Are
Mm-hmm.
you feeling like you want to control your partner's behavior because you aren't confident about the way in which you two engage in a sexual experience? Are you someone who's impacted by like religion or the way in which that you were taught growing up in church or in synagogue or in mosque or wherever you learned those certain ideas. Because once we get to the root of like what really is going on there, I think then we can start to really answer some questions around like why you might feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, like someone engaging in pleasure and joy for themselves is a really miraculous thing given all of the stigma and shame that we're told to experience in our American society.
Mm-hmm.
And so the more comfortable that we can get with feeling like, oh, this is like adding to my partner's life and my life, I think the closer we can be to like not shaming other people for their choices. At the same time, if you're someone who you're feeling like there is kind of some sort of thing that you're not understanding about your partner's engagement in solo play or about the kind of porn that they watch, I think that's another conversation. I think it's really important to recognize like what exactly is bothering you and how you can engage in an honest conversation with your partner about that if it is a legitimate concern that you have about the way in which they are engaging with solo play and with porn.
Thank you. It's really helpful, actually,
Yeah.
for a lot of people, because I think that's a narrative culturally for some people familiar, like they grew up in a family, in a household that presented that, or like you said, like within religion, like religious contexts kind of feed that narrative. And I love the idea of like, I think it's valid to feel that way, especially when that's the information you're conditioned to believe. But then also to your point of throughout this whole conversation, it's always like, well, can we be curious as to why? And like getting to the source of it and then kind of unraveling it a little bit and kind of loosening the reins around that belief system and where is it coming from, and then kind of working from that place. And I love that. Like, it's okay to have a concern. If there is a valid concern that you can kind of break down and be like, actually, it's this, and distill it and like communicate that with your partner and then work through it. I think there's at times like maybe a feeling of neglect from a partner because they're so committed to porn. I'm going to say like there's such a disconnect from actual partnership, and your partner is feeling neglected in like sexual satisfaction. And then to see you engaging with that, it's like there is a level of jealousy of like what's happening over here is not happening here. What is your take on that? Like when someone's experiencing that level of like neglect in their own pleasure because their partner is so kind of so far removed.
Yeah, I mean, I would consider that a legitimate concern, right? Like one of those things that I was just mentioning. I think if you're feeling like your partner is more dedicated to like engaging in porn than in having a sexual relationship with you, I think that is cause for conversation and figuring out what might be going on with them. Maybe the partner is experiencing some sort of like lack or kind of like confusion, or maybe they have a nervousness, again, back to like, well, I like this thing. Will my partner not like this thing? And I do want to say, like, having a conversation that's open and honest with your partner about like, hey, like, this is what I'm feeling. Like, can we make some time just for ourselves? Or can we talk about like your porn use, or if you feel like committed, whatever it is, like an open, honest conversation is really important for both people to feel like they're on the same page about their sexual relationship. Separate from that, I do want to say fantasy and like your partner's porn preference does not necessarily have anything to do with them not wanting you because you're different than them. Fantasy is a really important part, actually, of being able to feed the mind and allowing us to think through, how can I access these things that maybe I would want to access in my fantasy, but actually don't have any interest in accessing in my real life. And like that could be a really important outlet for some people to not feel like they are feeling shamed about their preferences or about their fantasies. And so maybe consider like what might be going on for your partner and like come to the conversation with empathy while also sharing like, this is how I've been feeling and these are my needs and I want to figure out how we can meet them together.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, it's like, of course, I would love to live in the world of Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or, all of these different fantasy lands. Like, but I actually wouldn't want to live there. I wouldn't want to, it's the escape of it. And it's allowing our imaginations and part of our being that isn't set in reality to expand and be explored. And it doesn't actually, to your point, it's not necessarily a reflection of the quality of your relationship or the quality of the sex you're having based off of your partner's fantasies or fetishes or anything like that.
Right. Totally.
So Danielle, we're going to wrap up. Is there anything we missed that you would like to, close up with or share?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to briefly mention my really fun masturbation experiment. And just for folks listening, if you go to sexedwithdb.com/magic wand experiment, you can read all about my experiment that I did with 3 weeks of using the magic wand and what that looked like. And I tracked like 27 variables throughout the experiment and learned a lot about masturbation and the place that it has in my life. So if you're curious, we have a masturbation experiment template that you can check out and sign up for. And I guess the last thing that I just want to wrap up with is that the way that you are is really wonderful. And we don't tell ourselves that enough. Like, listener, you are beautiful. You have a great body. Like, you are deserving of pleasure. And I think it's really, really important that we start to make daily practices of really believing that we are lovable, that we are really wonderful. Our bodies are great the way they are. They are deserving of pleasure. And the more that we believe that, the more likely we are to be able to access all of these wonderful things around pleasure, whether that's by ourselves or with a partner. And so I just really want you, listener, to believe that. And yeah, finally, if you are liking this conversation and enjoying my voice, I have over 170 podcast episodes wherever you get your podcasts. If you search Sex Ed with DB, and follow us on TikTok at Sex Ed with DB and on Instagram at Sex Ed with DB podcast. And Kat, I'm just really appreciative of you having me on today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I have one more thing to add to your closing. If our listeners are sex educators or in the sex industry, you're doing an amazing thing that I'm going to participate in around the business. And so if you wouldn't mind just sharing that as well, Danielle, before we sign off.
I would love to. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. So I have a workshop. It's called Building a Profitable Online Sexual Health Brand. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about sex ed and sexual health, and I am somehow equally passionate about teaching other people in this field how they can do what I'm doing, which is make a living doing this work. I'm someone with a master's of public health, and I think there are a lot of different ways that people can enter this field. If you're a content creator, a sexual health coach, a pleasure coach, a sex therapist, a sex educator, like whatever, wherever you fit in this realm, I created this workshop specifically for you to learn how you can access different brands and how you can structure your partnerships, how to create, a business from like creating an LLC to like doing your paperwork and doing your contracts and all of like the business bitch stuff, as well as how to like create a following on social media and cultivate your brand and like get access to other sex educators in the space. And so if this sounds exciting to you, we're doing a November cohort of 2023. So just next month. And if you go to sexedwithdb.com/workshop, you can learn all about the kinds of offerings that we have for this course. And you can send me an email through the form on that website, and I will get back to you and have you join our cohort. So that's sexedwithdb.com/workshop.
Yep. And if the timing doesn't work out, you're going to be hosting these on an annual basis so people can reach out and kind of get on a list.
Yes, exactly. Totally.
Amazing. Danielle, thank you so much. This was such a joy. I had so many goosebumps during this conversation and felt like such a great connection to you. And I love hearing your voice and what you have to say and how you express. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was really fantastic. I'm really appreciative.
Special thanks to all of our guests. Head South is hosted by Kat Meyer, produced by Isis Barlow, edited by Megan Hook, with music by Lily Rezi Rothman, graphics by Ella Chodos Irvine, cover art by Gina Ship Casey, and intro by Murph Meyer.
If you're looking for me, I'm heading south. All year round, I'm going down. Now you know where I'll be, I'm heading south. So Come on, look me right in the mouth.